Well, we're back in question period today. This is probably the least animated and interesting day of the week, but we're going to keep following this because there's a talk about the government proroguing Parliament earlier.
They will laugh in his face.
But we're going to wait and see what happens
because
today.
They can no longer pay for their homes anymore. Is he going to buy their homes for them? If he wants to quote studies, the International Monetary Fund says that Canada is the riskiest country in the OECD when it comes to mortgage loans. The governor of the Bank of Canada himself says that house payments could rise by 40% due to inflation. That's the reality that people experience every single day. Why does the government refuse to have a plan to balance the budget? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, as I have just said, Canada is expected to have the strongest economic growth in the OECD, in the G7 this year and next year. Mr. Speaker, one thing that my honourable colleague has not mentioned is the fact that today, there are 900,000 more Canadians that have jobs than those that have lost them during the pandemic. 128% more jobs than we had before the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, Canadians can trust in their future. The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, let us talk about Chinese interference, or rather let's talk about those who are victims of it and whose government refuses to talk about it. Defenders of democracy from the diaspora, from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the Solomon Islands. Minorities such as Uyghurs and Tibetans. The representatives have all come out with a bloc québécois to demand a public and independent inquiry into Chinese interference. Not because they're choosing sides in a partisan squabble, because they want to protect their communities and they feel abandoned by their government, by this government. When will it stop ignoring their call for an independent and public inquiry?
Mr. Speaker, what Canadians expect is that all parliamentarians in this place take the issues of foreign interference extremely seriously, that it's not a partisan issue. And part of that, Mr. Speaker, is actually doing the work that comes with Mr. Johnston's report. And I note that the leader of the bloc has decided not to actually look at the information that is provided to him, that is the basis of Mr. Johnston's report. So, Mr. Speaker, if opposition want to criticize the work of Mr. Johnston, they should first look at the documents included.
The Deputy de Saint-Jean.
Mr. Speaker, the picture speaks for itself. None of the pro-democracy groups, representatives of the diaspora and minorities who are victims of the Chinese regime support the government's approach, none whatsoever. And the government would know this if its rapporteur had taken the time to talk to them before publishing his report. They're all calling for a public inquiry led by an independent commissioner with subpoena powers. They want us to finally get to the heart of the matter and tackle Beijing's meddling tactics, finally. When will the government finally listen to them? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Protecting Canadian democracy is a responsibility that we take very seriously. When the opposition wants to play political games, we on this side are taking serious measures. We want to continue with the implementation of a transparency register on foreign interference. We want to strengthen the control and oversight mechanism when it comes to protecting our democratic institutions. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, a 9th interest rate hike by the Bank of Canada is hitting Quebecers hard. Imagine having worked all your life to fulfill your dream of buying a house, Mr. Speaker. Then, a few years later, you're forced to sell it because your monthly payment has risen from $2,300 to $3,800, a 64% increase in just 1 year. That is the harsh reality for families in Quebec and just about everywhere else in the country. What are the Liberals going to do to help these families who are losing or are about to lose their homes? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. We all agree that Canadians have been hit by an increase in rent and mortgages. The federal government...
Yeah, do they admit that they're responsible for it? No, they never will.
Not only that, we also
just wait for that grocery rebate in the mail.
Around the table for these decisions. In the 2023 budget, we will take measures and publish directives to help people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
CEOs cash in on their quarterly profits, Canadians lost 17,000 jobs in 1 month alone. To Liberals and Conservatives, economic recovery just looks like somebody else's unemployment. But for everyday people, it looks like economic punishment. So
you're the one supporting this government.
Why does this government refuse to fix unemployment insurance while so many Canadians continue to lose their jobs?
They're propping up the Liberal government.
Mr. Speaker,
and they got the nerve
economy remains strong. We have experienced
to
the
suggest
strongest economic growth in the G7 over the last year. Our unemployment rate remains low at 5.2%. We have recovered 128% of the jobs lost since the start of the pandemic. However, we are also working hard to make sure that we are looking after all workers, including those that have lost their jobs. We are making record investment in skills training, record investment in affordable housing. We're partnering with labor and industry on generational investment in the VW plant in St. Thomas and the Stellantis plant in Windsor, and we are modernizing the EI system to make sure it is there for all workers when they need it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes.
In a growing conflict of interest, the Prime Minister's rapporteur was paying the same firm for advice as one of the people he was supposed to be investigating. That person, of course, is the former Liberal member for Don Valley North, who left the Liberal caucus amid a foreign interference scandal. And Johnston didn't even interview him. Canadians don't trust this process, and they can't believe Johnston's report. Will the Prime Minister finally call a public inquiry like this House has called on him to do 3 times?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, what we see is another conservative who is taking a page out of the Trump playbook, where it's just personal attacks when they don't
what a
like
pathetic
the
woman.
Outcome. Mr. Speaker, the
what an
Conservatives
excuse
made the conclusion
for a parliamentary
prior
secretary.
to Mr. Johnston's report. They were never going to accept it. So to pretend now that it's the process they're upset about, when, Mr. Speaker, all it is partisan games. We on this side of the House take the importance of our democratic institutions seriously, and that's why we appointed someone with Mr. Johnston's credibility to this position.
He doesn't have any credibility left now.
If they took democratic institutions seriously, they'd respect the will of the democratically elected people of this House. Voting 3 times for there to be a public inquiry instead, they wanted a Liberal solution to a Liberal problem, and that's why they appointed a member of the Trudeau Foundation, who then hired some Liberals to help him out, and when he thought he was in a conflict of interest, asked another member of the Trudeau Foundation to say that he wasn't. Now we learn, of course, that he and the person he was supposed to be investigating were both getting advice from the same firm. It's levels of conflict of interest with these Liberals. Canadians have had enough. A majority of them want a public inquiry. Will the Prime Minister finally call one today?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Speaker, once again, Canadians can see on full display that the Conservatives are not serious about foreign interference. What they'd rather do is just take personal attacks. Another proof point of this, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that we had David Johnston at Proc for over 3 hours, and the Conservatives,
and he said absolutely nothing.
Questioning time, didn't ask a
he couldn't even seem to remember his name.
Question for over 15 minutes worth of their time. Instead, they went for personal attacks, because, Mr. Speaker, to them, foreign interference is a partisan game, but to Canadians, it's serious business.
Not to you.
The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Michael.
Speaker, for the Prime Minister's loyal rapporteur, it is conflict after conflict. He hired the crisis management firm Navigator, the same firm hired by the member for Don Valley North, who happened to be the subject of a rapporteur's investigation and for whom the rapporteur conveniently exonerated without even interviewing. This conflict goes to the heart of a rapporteur's questionable conclusions. His report has no credibility. He needs to go. When will the Prime Minister fire him and finally call an independent public inquiry?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, once again, the Conservatives question Mr. Johnston's report, yet their leader, they're cheering.
Just hold on. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, they're cheering the fact that they live under a veil of ignorance, and they're proud to do so.
She got that phrase down
Mr.
pat.
Johnston's report, they question, even though their own leader has said he refuses to read the information in which it was based on. So, Mr. Speaker, if Canadians want to see somebody who is serious in this House on foreign interference, they should not look at the Conservatives, because all we see is question after question, personal attacks.
The honourable member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, enough is enough. The conflicts are everywhere. The rapporteur is a family friend of the Prime Minister. He is a member of the Beijing financed and compromised Trudeau Foundation. He hired a team of Liberals to draft and defend the conclusions of his report. And now this. How many conflicts with this rapporteur is the Prime Minister willing to ignore? When will he fire him and finally call an independent public inquiry?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, what I find highly suspicious is the fact that the members opposite sit and take nothing but personal attacks and offer no solutions, no suggestions on how to actually strengthen our democratic institutions. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are nothing more than conspiracy theories, personal attacks, just like the Trump administration.
Just like who?
But on this side of the House,
He wasn't even sure who she's talking about. Forgot her lines. Why? They sure bring out the winners on Friday. How did this woman get a parliamentary secretary job?
Mr. Speaker,
She can't even lie well.
A lot in the scandal of Beijing's interference in our democracy. First, the lower Liberal rapporteur.
That's the first thing you learn as a Liberal parliamentary secretary, is how to lie effectively. And she's not even doing that very well. Can't even remember Donald Trump's name.
Witnesses from his report. Yesterday, we learned that the loyal rapporteur and a Liberal MP targeted by his investigation had hired the same crisis management firm. How can Liberal MPs blindly follow the Prime Minister in yet another conflict of interest? When will they finally send the rapporteur packing? Well, let's speak about the special rapporteur.
He'll go packing on his second retirement, probably somewhere to Fiji.
He himself said, we have before us a very credible individual, and I think that history has very little to do with the fact that he has had a very distinguished career. End of quote.
He's had a life at the government trough.
To play political games, they could simply just follow and receive the information from our intelligence bodies. The Honourable Member from Mégantic-L'Érable. Since then, he's been trapped by the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. Sacha Trudeau, Sheila Bloch, Valérie Blais, Don Guy, Pierre-Elliott Trudeau, David Johnston, Frank Iacobucci, Maurice Rosenberg, Member of Parliament for Don Valley North, Navigator. All these people and organizations have links with the Prime Minister. Now, the problem is that these are all main players in the play put on by the Prime Minister to avoid triggering an independent public inquiry into Beijing's interference. No one believes in Mr. Johnson's independence anymore. When will the Prime Minister finally fire his friend Johnson and launch a truly independent inquiry? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister for Economic Development. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague once again wants to play political games with protecting Canadian democracy. We take this very seriously on this side. The Conservatives are focusing on political games. On this side, we are taking measures. This rapporteur is eminently qualified, and no one in my riding, no one has come up to me to say that this person was not credible. So we're
obviously you don't meet very many people in your riding. Is your office even open?
He is studying the matter, and we'll work well with him, Mr. Speaker.
These are some of the poorest of the poor.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 months of lockout at the port of Quebec City, just imagine, employees have just received their first offer from management, and they rejected it by 98%. How could this happen? Simple. At the federal level, the employer has no need to negotiate. It hires strike breakers and replaces workers with crabs, just like in 1920. It's the federal government that's responsible for getting this dispute bogged down with its labor laws worthy of the last century. When will it finally move into the 21st century and ban scabs? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Labour.
Mr. Speaker, through you to the member, this government has done more for Canadian workers than any government in the past. We are on track. We are continuing
always hyperbole from these liberals. They've done more of this, more of that than anybody else.
And the workers, and we are on track to ban replacement workers by the end of this year. It's part of the budget, and we're on track to do it. Merci.
The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. Mr. Speaker, well, let's do it now. Not you, Mr. Speaker, but the government. And that is the reason for which the Bloc Québécois has once again tabled another bill to ban scabs. Quebec has banned scabs since the 1970s. What's good for all workers in Quebec should also be good for workers under federal jurisdiction. This government claims to defend the middle class. Well, if that's the case, when will it take up our bill and ban scabs, which allow workers' rights to be trampled underfoot?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Labour.
As I mentioned, we are on, we've wrapped up consultations. We're taking the feedback that we have received from unions, employers, and Indigenous groups to inform our legislation, which will be tabled by the end of this year. This is the latest evolution in policy to protect the collective bargaining process. We need to strike a balance between doing it quickly and getting it right. So I encourage the opposite member to support our budget so that we can get this job done.
The Honourable Member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this week, the Bank of Canada hiked interest rates. This is a direct result of the government's inflation-inducing fiscal policy driven by frivolous tax and spend policies that bankrupt Canadians. As a result, reams of struggling Canadians will default on their mortgages, putting the dreams of homeownership even further out of reach. We do have a solution. We will stop the deficits, rein in inflation, stem interest rates, and end the defaults. Mr. Speaker, are they willing to put partisanship aside, work with the opposition, and end this inflationary deficit spending?
Watch them say it's targeted, non-inflationary spending. That's the talking point.
I must admit on the matter that the last comment from my colleague has surprised me. If she wants to collaborate, I would invite her to stop filibustering on the budget. In a budget that seeks to give strict directives to protect Canadians when it comes to getting mortgages in exceptional circumstances. It's in Budget 2023, and they voted against, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we have been extremely clear. We are willing to put party politics aside, sit down with the government, and hash out a budget that will actually help Canadians instead of punishing them. Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government is far too eager to ram through this legislation in this House instead of putting in the necessary work to deliver a fiscally responsible budget. Mr. Speaker, will this government accept our proposal to work together, sit down with us on this side of the House, and work in the best interests of Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we know that all the students that go to summer school are the ones that don't do their homework throughout the rest of the year, and that's exactly what the Conservatives did. They spent 2 months filibustering the budget. We were talking about how we could positively contribute to solutions for affordability for Canadians, to create jobs for Canadians from coast to coast to coast, and for
You didn't spend 2 months
weeks,
filibustering the
Conservatives
budget.
decided to talk to themselves and send away Canadians that were coming to the table with solutions that were going to work. So for them to come up this morning and say that they want to revamp a budget over the summer, I invite them to draft it. It would be nice to have a single solution in this House from the other side.
Here, here. The Honourable Member for Essex.
Speaker, this Liberal Prime Minister, along with the costly NDP coalition, have made the dream of home ownership and starting a family far out of reach for working young adults in my riding. They have done everything they were asked to do and left with only fear and tears. Speaker, will the Prime Minister end his inflationary deficit spending and let young adults begin their lives and start a family?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, youth unemployment has gone down under our budget. We've provided more jobs through the Canada Summer Jobs Program. So we're making sure that there are jobs available, whether that's on small craft harbors in Atlantic Canada, whether that's in the aerospace industry in Quebec, whether that's at car manufacturing in Ontario, on farms in the prairies, or in biotech companies in BC. We're going to make sure that there's lots of opportunities for young individuals to have high-paying, sustainable jobs in the future. That's why we're investing in this country, because we believe in the future, unlike the Conservatives.
Canada's summer jobs are not sustainable. What a crock.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if the Liberal NDP coalition doesn't care about the future generations, what do they say to the homeowner that can't pay their mortgage because this Liberal government overspent and caused inflation, which caused mortgage rate hikes? This Prime Minister is stripping the hopes, dreams, and house keys from the hands of Canadians. Shameful. When will he realize the pain and suffering he is causing?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister.
I think context is important. Inflation in Canada is in fact coming down. It reached a peak of 8.1%. It's now at 4.4%. It's going to go below 3% as it's projected before the end of this year. And despite the fact that it's coming down, it's already lower than what it is in the United States, what it is in the United Kingdom, what it is in Europe, and what it is in the OECD. That means that we can afford to make investments in making life more affordable. No Canadians are convinced that their lives are going to be more affordable by getting rid of dental care, getting rid of childcare, eliminating the CBC, stopping to fight climate change. They have no good ideas on the other side of the House, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Mr. Speaker, close to 1 million people living with a disability live in poverty, and the Liberals left them to suffer. The Canada Disability Benefit must be the solution to finally enable them to make ends meet. Otherwise, this government continues to be part of the problem. People living with a disability deserve to live in dignity. Will the Liberals ensure that this new benefit will lift people living with a disability out of poverty?
It's a softball.
The Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable colleague for the excellent question. I thank her for her collaboration and her advocacy on this critically important question. In Canada, no person with a disability should live in poverty, period. That's why we are creating the Canada Disability Benefit, an income supplement with the potential to seriously reduce poverty and improve financial security for hundreds of thousands of working-age persons with disabilities. In February, this House unanimously adopted Bill C-22. Bill C-22 is now on the calendar for debate in this House for June 14th. We are looking forward to getting this legislation past the finish line as quickly as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Nunavut.
I stand in solidarity with the unionized workers and their families of the Iqaluit Housing Authority. They have been on strike for close to 3 months. The Labour Minister remains silent as the Iqaluit Housing Authority brings in scabs and undermines workers' rights. New Democrats have introduced anti-scab legislation to stop this. Will the minister support the NDP's bill to protect unionized workers?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Labour.
Speaker, the best deals are made at the bargaining table, and federal mediators are in touch with the parties. Our federal mediators are very good at what they do, and we have faith in their ability to help parties reach an agreement. We're on track to ban the use of replacement workers by the end of this year, but we need to strike a balance between doing things quickly and getting things done right, as I mentioned before. Thank you very much for the question.
The Honourable Member for Richmond Hill.
Mr. Speaker, the COVID-19 pandemic has strained our healthcare system, disrupted our economy, and changed the way we interact every day. We know that better healthcare for Canadians means supporting our healthcare workers and ensuring patients receive timely access to health services they deserve. Yesterday, the Minister of Health announced direct support to Medical Council of Canada, the National Registry of Physicians, the Foundation for Advancing Family Medicine, and Canadian Alliance of Medical Laboratory Professional Regulators. Mr. Speaker, can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health and to the Minister of Sport please tell this House how yesterday's announcement is addressing current and emerging labor demands in healthcare?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my friend and colleague from Richmond Hill for his hard work and his excellent advocacy in his riding and on Health Committee for foreign credentials qualifications. Mr. Speaker, yesterday our government announced $78.5 million for 3 projects that support foreign credentials qualifications for internationally trained medical graduates to grow support our healthcare workforce. These projects will help improve the process for recognizing foreign credentials for internationally educated health professionals and improve labor mobility for physicians, making it easier for them to work where they are most needed throughout our country. Our government's priority remains to work together to support our healthcare workers so that patients across Canada get the care they need when they need it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Mr. Speaker, this government continues to add fuel to the inflationary fire, despite the finance minister's words that deficits must be reduced and that this is a line that cannot be crossed. Well, what happens? Inflation goes up, so interest rates goes up, so Canadians default on their mortgages and Canadians lose their homes. What's the solution? The solution is to stop the inflationary spending, stop the interest rates so that Canadians can have lower inflation rates and lower interest rates. Is the government ready to do this, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, it's unfortunate that the Conservatives don't believe that we can fight inflation and fight climate change at the same time. Yet, emissions and inflation are both coming down in Canada.
You're doing nothing to fight climate change. All you're doing is taxing Canadians with a stupid carbon tax that has absolutely no effect on greenhouse gases because people still have to drive to work.
In 2023 and in 2024,
This is such idiocy. These people just throw these talking points out without thinking about what they're even saying.
Member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Have the greatest level of household debt in Canada that we have ever had. And as well, the IMF states that out of the G7, it is Canadians who are most likely to default on their mortgages. Even the finance minister recognizes that Canadians are struggling. She said that Canadians are facing hardships as a result of high interest rates. So then why doesn't this government commit to eliminating inflationary deficits, eliminating inflationary spending so that Canadians can have lower inflation and lower interest rates, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
I'd like to thank my colleague for her question. As she knows, the National Housing Strategy is not just helping people to pay their rent. It's also to help them access the dream of owning a home. My colleagues on the other side voted against the budget, which had measures to help Canadians directly if they're struggling with mortgage payments under exceptional circumstances. I invite her to read that part of the budget and vote in favor of it.
Falls.
Speaker, the IMF warns Canada is at the greatest risk of home mortgage defaults in the world. This Liberal government's out-of-control spending and massive deficits have caused inflation to skyrocket. Canadians cannot absorb these higher rates, placing their dreams of home ownership at risk. Families are struggling, and they are struggling because of this Liberal government. Will the Prime Minister end his inflationary deficit spending?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Speaker, despite what the Conservatives says, everyone knows that inflation is a global phenomenon.
They wouldn't be liberals if they ended their inflationary spending. That's what makes a liberal a liberal.
Our budget not only retains this fiscal advantage, allows inflation to continue to decrease, makes life more affordable for Canadians, invests significantly in healthcare and in dental care, while creating high-paying, sustainable jobs to go above and beyond the close to 900,000.
He said that same line the last time he was up.
The Honourable Member for Niagara Falls.
Speaker, Canadians simply can't afford the higher cost of living brought about by these Liberal government's policies. They are being forced to work more shifts or find a second job simply to get by. Canadians deserve our help, and Budget 2023 only makes the cost of living crisis worse. Conservatives are ready to work through the summer to fix their mistakes. Will this Liberal government cancel their vacation plans?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Speaker, my summer plans are going back and talking to my constituents, finding out possible solutions to make Canada better. And I hope that Conservatives will do the same. I wish that the Conservatives will do what they say, go over the summer, find solutions, and bring it to this House. The only solutions that they brought to this House so far is cancel the CBC, stop the fight against climate change, raid the pension benefits of seniors. Those are not viable solutions, Mr. Speaker. So if they can spend the summer coming up with
It's a
some
very viable solution to sell the CBC.
Mr. Speaker, when lockdowns came at the start of the pandemic, the government set up the Emergency Business Account for small businesses. Maximum loans of $60,000, with $20,000 being forgivable if people repaid it within a certain time frame. And it was the right thing to do. 900,000 small business owners needed it. But the December 31 deadline is coming fast, and 40% are worried they won't be able to pay back the loan in full, which would mean losing eligibility for the loan forgiveness part of their loan and threatening their survival. Can the government offer them a little flexibility? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade. I appreciate the question from the Bloc Québécois because it highlights the importance of small and medium businesses here in Canada. We've always been there to help and support small and medium business. We reduced tax from 11 to 9%. The opposition voted against it. We've always been there during the pandemic with the loans that were mentioned by the member for the other side. What we've just done with the budget is reduce transaction fees for credit cards for small and medium businesses, and the opposition voted against. The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Mr. Speaker, the government doesn't even does not even seem to be able to answer its own questions. Now, December 31st seemed like a reasonable time at the start of the pandemic, but there were variables that extended the crisis: supply problems, costs, labor shortages, deserted downtowns. With 6 months to go, almost 250,000 businesses are at risk of closing down. Will the government allow them, if needed, to enter into repayment agreements without losing the forgivable part of their loan? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. What we need to focus on is that the loans granted to small and medium businesses were a maximum of $60,000, and a third was forgivable if they were able to repay 2/3 by the expected timeline. We're always listening to small and medium businesses when they have concerns, and that's why in the budget we've reduced transaction fees linked to credit cards that affect small and medium businesses here in Canada. Thank you.
For Bam Fairdrie.
Well, not long ago, the Liberal Minister of Finance said, by exercising fiscal restraint and by not pouring fuel on the fire of inflation today, we will ensure we can responsibly invest in Canadians and in a Canadian economy for years to come. Yet, here we are, $60 billion in new spending and interest rates at their highest level in 22 years. They call that restraint? They're practicing about the same amount of restraint as a kid in a candy store. So when will they stop gouging Canadians and end their inflationary spending?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, we are putting forward a plan that is fiscally responsible. That's why inflation is coming down. If the member's not aware, it peaked at 8.1%. It's now at 4.4%.
You know it is
projected to go lower.
completely fraudulent.
If that member thinks that he's going to convince Canadians that he's going to make life more affordable by suggesting that we delete all the
You
programs
can't
that make
increase
life
the price
more
of gas
affordable,
by
like
30
dental care,
cents
like child
and have an
care,
inflation
like
rate of
CCV,
4%.
like
That is
investing in
absolutely
retirement
absurd.
security for seniors.
They're cooking
I
the
don't think he's gonna
books.
fool anybody
These
other than
figures
perhaps
are
the other
completely
members sitting on the other side of this
inaccurate.
House.
A member for Bam Fairdrie.
Well, let's just talk a little bit about the people that are hardest hit by the...
Okay, hold on. I know someone doesn't know how to use their headset, maybe, so just want to make sure people have their headsets on mute. I know it's the first day with some stuff like this. So, okay, ready? Gentleman member for Bam Fairdrie.
Let's talk about the people hardest hit by the Liberals' inflationary spending just for a minute here. They claim to be a champion of equality. They claim that, and they weave that word into every announcement they make. But for them, it's nothing more than a buzzword. In the words of one of the Prime Minister's own former advisors,
They don't use equality. They use equity.
Disproportionately lower income Canadians and young families, potentially creating divisions and threatening new sorts of inequality. So when will this government drop the platitudes and stop gouging the Canadians struggling the most?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives have no credibility when it comes to supporting families. When they were in power, they sent out checks to millionaires with their universal child benefit. Our Canada Child Benefit has supported tens of thousands of families in my riding alone, Mr. Speaker. If the Conservatives really want to support families, then they should support dental care, which has provided dental care for 1,100 members of constituents in the riding of Carleton, over 1,000 kids in my riding as well, Mr. Speaker. How about some solutions from the other side rather than just constant slogans?
Constant slogans.
Mr. Speaker, for 8 years, this Prime Minister has spent lavishly, leading to devastating effects for Canadians. Accumulated deficits are leading to inflationary pressures. Everyone knows this. Inflation led to higher interest rates. The Bank of Canada just raised its rates, and now mortgage payments are higher. When will this Prime Minister finally understand that he has to stop inflationary spending that is pushing people out of their homes and into the streets? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. I invite my honourable colleague to look at the budget because he can see very clearly that the deficit is going down over the next several years. All of that in spite of the contrary winds blowing around the world. Within G7 countries, our budget, our government has the lowest deficit. We have the lowest debt. And our GDP to debt ratio is the lowest. It's thanks to our leadership that we were able to achieve these targets. The Honourable Member for Pontiac. Mr. Speaker, last week, there was a very important meeting between federal, provincial, and territorial governments on protecting wildlife and biodiversity. They talked about how to work together to hit very significant targets in terms of biodiversity, which they agreed to at COP15. One of the most important targets is the goal of protecting 30% of our land mass. Can the Parliamentary Secretary for the Environment inform this House on Canada's progress? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. I thank my colleague for her question. COP15 in Montreal was an incredible victory for Canada and the planet. We're going to draw up an action plan. I'm pleased with the commitment of provinces and territories to contribute to our goal of conserving 30% of Canada's land by 2030, an objective based on slowing the decline of wildlife species. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Yellowhead.
Mr. Speaker, on September 16, 2021, Cody McConnell's life was forever changed because his fiancée, Mikhail Bush, and 16-month-old son, Noah McConnell, were murdered by a registered sex offender who was deemed highly likely to reoffend. Noah's law will protect vulnerable women and children who are most likely to be victims of sex offenders. Mr. Speaker, will the Liberals do the right thing? Pick up the bill and make Noah's Law a reality today.
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member
for the Injustice Minister's in town.
I salute the empathy and the place from which that good place from which the question came. Mr. Speaker, our sympathies go out to Cody McConnell and his family and friends for his loss. I tabled, Mr. Speaker, in the Senate, Bill S-12, whose intention is precisely to preserve and strengthen the Sexual Offenders Registry. Mr. Speaker, I've undertaken publicly, and I will do it again now, to look at the proposed Noah's Law to see if it is in conformity with what we're trying to do, and to work with members across the floor to see what we can do.
Honourable Member for Regina Wascana.
This Liberal government have given Canadians higher deficits, higher inflation, and higher interest rates.
which of course leads to higher mortgage payments.
Hey,
According
the
to a recent
Conservatives
study
took over
by the International Monetary Fund,
that
Canadians
old
are
riot
now
from
the most at risk to default on their mortgages. And this problem will only get worse as more and more Canadians renew their mortgages at higher interest rates. Mr. Speaker, when will the Prime Minister end his inflationary deficit spending?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, as I've had the opportunity to say many times in this House, our plan is fiscally responsible. Inflation is coming down. It's at 4.4%. We expect it to be less than 3% before the end of this year. At the same time, we're investing in making life more affordable, and we can afford to do that because we have the lowest deficit, and because we have the lowest net debt to GDP ratio, and because we have the fastest growing economic growth at 3.1% in the G7. We need to take advantage of our good fiscal framework and make sure that we make life more affordable for Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Immigration designed overly narrow criteria for admitting the families of Afghan language and cultural
There's Scott.
whose lives are now in danger. They can't get to Canada, and the Minister refuses to schedule meetings with Afghans who want to fix the rules and save these lives. Why can the Minister find the time in his schedule
You don't
to
see
announce
people for
visa-free
5 or 6
travel for
years.
people
They
from other
always look a
countries,
lot
but
older.
not take a
I haven't
meeting
seen
with a
Scott in a
brave
while.
Afghan who served Canada and whose family may be killed because of that service?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member for his questions, and certainly I want to reiterate to this House that the resettlements and resettling of Afghans remains our very top priority. These Afghans have worked side by side with Canadian Armed Force in our mission in Afghanistan to promote the peace and the democracy in this region. But let me be very clear, Mr. Speaker, we will not turn our backs on these brave Afghans who have worked with us, and we will do everything we can to get Afghans to safety.
Probably a little
Merci,
late
Monsieur
now,
Président.
lady.
The Honourable Member for Yukon.
Mr. Speaker, we know that a significant gap remains for Indigenous peoples living in urban, rural, and northern areas when it comes to housing. There's an urgent need to act now. Could the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing elaborate on how our government is upholding the right to housing?
Oh, there's another softball.
21 and 23, with an
Tell
emphasis
us
on
about
the
how
for
well the
Indigenous
Liberal
by
Party
Indigenous
policies
approach,
are working.
and how this recently announced partnership with the National Indigenous Collaborative Housing Incorporated is designed to rapidly address the urgent needs and long-term housing challenges of Indigenous peoples across Canada.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank my colleague for his questions and all his hard work. Too many Indigenous people in urban, rural, and northern communities do not have the housing they need. That's why our government committed to a co-developing for Indigenous, by Indigenous, urban, rural, and northern housing strategy. Yesterday, we announced an immediate funding of $287 million with the National Indigenous Collaborative Housing, and it's just the beginning. Through the budget 2023, we're investing an additional $4 billion. As we advance towards reconciliation, our focus remains on providing safe, affordable home for all. Thank you, Mr. President.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Strathcona.
Albertans have made it very clear they do not want coal mining in the Rocky Mountains. Coal mining in the eastern slopes threatens our land and our water. It's not good for our planet. It's not good for Albertans. Yet the minister is fine with an Australian coal mining company carving out more than 500 hectares of Grand Mountain. Based on my private member's bill, this government promised that all coal mining would trigger a federal environmental impact assessment. Albertans want it, First Nations want it. So where is the impact assessment on the Grand Cache mine?
The Honourable Parliamentary
Yeah,
Secretary to the
you keep
Minister
those
of
things
Natural
going,
Resources.
it'll hold up projects for
Commitment to end the export of
decades.
thermal coal, and we are working across all sectors of our economy to make sure that we're reducing emissions. We put in place a robust impact assessment system that is there to make sure that there are regional assessments and impact assessments that take into account environmental concerns, and that we have a very objective system that is there. I make sure that the member opposite looks at the improvements that we have made towards those policies.
The honourable member for Spadina, Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, in May 2022, the IRCC committee tabled a report that noted overt and subtle racism at its offices abroad, especially at posts where visa decisions were delegated to locally engaged staff, such as in South Africa. It's come to my attention that an unofficial filter system has been incorporated in that country. White local staff are overwhelmingly refusing visa applications from predominantly Black South Africans. Indeed, white visa applications are being placed in one pile and non-white in another. Mr. Speaker, this is unconscionable. Can the minister confirm or deny if Canada is running an apartheid-era visa selection process in South Africa?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
No, but it's running an apartheid system about everything else.
Mr. Speaker, let me
It
be
favors
very clear
everybody
that
but
we
white
have zero
males.
tolerance for racism or discrimination of any kind. That's why we've already hard at work.
Now that's a
to
joke.
address the racism and create real lasting change. We created the Anti-Racism Task Force. We continue to provide training to address unconscious bias to all of our employees. Also, IRCC has released our new
A litany of all
anti-racism strategy
the microaggression
2.0,
policies
Mr.
this
Speaker,
liberal
but we know
government
that
has
there is more
introduced,
to do,
and
we
unfortunately,
keep
in many
working
cases,
hard to keep
passed.
fight of all discrimination and build on our finding. Merci, Monsieur Président.
That's all the time we have for question period today. Thank you for your
Well,
indulgence.
I hope you all enjoyed that. It's a muted example of question period on Fridays. I used to be there. But I hope you join us again next week. We're going to be doing this until the House recesses. Could be prorogued early, but I've heard that every year.
At midnight.
But we will be following the excitement, and I hope the commentary keeps you excited. We're going to say goodbye
First of
for
all,
now.
Thank you on behalf of chair occupants, so we can get that schedule done.